No one understood what was happening. In the middle of an elegant dinner, among crystal glasses and arrogant gazes, the most powerful man in the city, the one who never showed emotion, stood up trembling with a choked voice and murmured something no one ever imagined hearing from him. "Hug me," in front of them. The silence was instant. The silverware stopped, conversations died, and everyone watched incredulous as that feared billionaire begged for a simple human gesture from a young plus-size waitress. In that instant, something bigger than money, status, or power was about to happen, and no one there had any idea how that hug would change everything. The sound of silverware suddenly ceased, as if time itself had choked on the absurdity of what was about to happen. The restaurant, known for its sophistication, was the kind of place where even the sound of laughter had a limit. There, among golden chandeliers, perfectly aligned tables, and glasses that reflected the candlelight, no one dared to raise their voice. But that night, something broke the protocol of elegance. In the center of the room, the most powerful man in the country, James Mitchell, the billionaire who dictated the course of markets, destroyed competitors, and decided the fate of thousands with simple signature, stood up trembling, his face pale and his breathing uneven. All eyes turned to him, surprised, fearing the worst. Some thought he was feeling sick, others that someone had offended him. But what they saw next made many hearts beat slower. With a hoarse voice, James murmured something no one expected to hear from a man like him. "Hug me," in front of them. The sound of the words seemed to echo off the walls. The pianist stopped playing, the waiters froze, and an almost sacred silence took over the atmosphere. For a few seconds, no one moved. The air became heavy, as if all the atmosphere had been sucked into a single point. That powerful man vulnerable before a young plus-size waitress. Emily, with wide eyes, still held the tray as if she were in a nightmare. She didn't understand what was happening. The billionaire, the same one who had never looked at anyone he considered inferior, now asked for a simple gesture, almost childlike, but one that sounded impossible in that scenario. People glanced at each other, whispering hypotheses. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others watched, curious, like someone watching an unlikely scene in an expensive theater. Emily, however, felt her heart racing. She was an ordinary employee, used to going unnoticed, to being judged by looks that cut through her body like invisible knives. She never imagined that, one day, she would be the center of attention, especially because of such a disarming request. "Hug me." Those two words echoed inside her, mixing shame, fear, and compassion. And that's when something almost imperceptible happened. James's expression changed. That cold look, which for years had frozen executives and destroyed careers, was now moist human, almost pleading. He wasn't asking for pity. He was asking for salvation. And Emily, even without understanding, felt a lump form in her throat. It was as if she could see, behind that expensive suit and imposing posture, a man lost within himself. The guests, not knowing what to do, remained motionless, hypnotized by the strangeness of the scene. The clock marked slow seconds, and each breath seemed like thunder. The silence became witness to something much bigger than any speech, the fall of the pride that had lasted decades. And if anyone there believed that real stories of transformation only happen in movies, that night everyone discovered otherwise. Because what began as a business dinner was about to become one of the most emotional and talked about stories in that city. And the reason behind that unlikely request would soon be revealed when James's past came to light, carrying secrets that few could bear to hear. Before that dinner, few knew how much was behind the name James Mitchell to the world. He was a living portrait of success, the kind of man who seems to have been born with a golden touch. At 40, he commanded an international empire that united luxury hotels, tech companies, and fashion brands. His image was in magazines, business covers, and television programs that called him investment genius. But no one talked about what he sacrificed to get there. James didn't build an empire. He erected a wall. Brick by brick, he stacked achievements, titles, and zeros in his bank account until he became unreachable. He was the kind of man who didn't smile, not because he didn't know how, but because he had forgotten how. His gaze was cold, calculating, and his presence intimidating. In the hallways of his companies, the sound of heels and hurried steps always mixed with the fear of making mistakes. And the curious thing is that he took pride in that. For him, respect was earned through fear, and admiration came from distance. But like every story that seems perfect, his also had cracks that no one saw, and that were about to open. Whoever looked from the outside saw a successful man, but whoever looked closely, if they had the courage, would see a tired man. James lived surrounded by luxury, but luxury didn't surround him with peace. He slept little, ate poorly, and his routine was timed as if every second was worth money. He had a mansion where the lights never went out, but the silence was louder than any music. There was no laughter, no voices, no happy memories, only the echo of his own decisions. What no one knew is that the billionaire carried an invisible weight, guilt. He didn't talk about it, of course. Men like James don't cry, don't vent, don't ask for help. They move forward, even if the soul stays behind. But there's a limit to how much you can pretend to be steel when inside your heart bleeds. And that limit, James had crossed long ago. That's why, when he stood up that night and asked a plus-size waitress for a hug, it wasn't weakness. It was a cry for help that had been swallowed for years. And it's curious how life puts us face to face with the reflections we try to avoid. James had spent 2 decades running from his own humanity, but it would catch up with him unexpectedly, like a mirror that breaks and shows what was hidden. His name was synonymous with power, but the power he had was the same that consumed him. Every company he bought, every competitor he brought down, every applause he received, everything pushed him a little further from himself. He was admired by many and loved by no one, and deep down he knew it. Maybe that's why the silence in the restaurant hurt him so much. It was the sound of emptiness screaming. The same emptiness that began years ago, in a moment that would forever change the course of his life. The day he lost Sarah, the only person who truly knew him. But that part of the story is the one that hurts the most, and also the one that explains the reason for that unexpected request. James Mitchell wasn't born bad. No one is born that way. He just learned too early that the world doesn't forgive the weak. He grew up watching his father be humiliated by bosses and broken promises, and swore to himself that he would never go through that. From a young age, he believed that feeling was dangerous, that compassion was synonymous with defeat. And little by little, he transformed. The light smile of a boy gave way to a hard countenance, and ambition, which began as a desire to win, became an obsession to dominate. With each goal achieved, each competitor brought down, James felt the same pleasure a general feels when winning a war. But he didn't realize that, in these battles, he was also destroying people, dreams, families, emotional stories that crossed his path, and that he simply erased as if they didn't matter. And the higher he climbed, the more distant he became from what made him human. He became ruthless not because he wanted to, but because he believed it was the only way to survive. Behind the scenes of his empire, the reports were terrifying. Experienced executives trembled when receiving a call from him. Employees avoided meeting his gaze. James had the cruel gift of identifying each person's weak point and using it without hesitation. He was cold, logical, almost surgical in his decisions. When he fired someone, he did it with an empty look, without emotion. For him, it was just a piece being removed from the board. And yet at night, when silence took over the house, something inside him began to scream. He no longer knew if what he felt was regret or just the weight of being who he was. He tried to convince himself that he didn't need anyone, that empathy was a distraction for the weak. But deep down, what moved him was no longer ambition. It was guilt, a shapeless guilt, but one that consumed him in silence, like a flame that never goes out. And that's how many powerful people live. Surrounded by luxury, but tormented by what money can't buy, peace. Everything began to change the day Sarah entered his life. She was the opposite of everything he represented. Sweet, generous, light. Where he saw threat, she saw potential. Where he saw weakness, she saw humanity. Sarah taught him to laugh again, to find pleasure in small things, to breathe without hurry. And for a while, James believed he could be a different man. But fate, ironic and merciless, tends to test those who try hardest to change. On that birthday, the only one she planned to surprise him, Sarah went out driving alone, carrying in the passenger seat the gift that symbolized a new phase for both of them. A simple ring with an engraving that said, "There's still time." But she never got to deliver it. A brutal accident took Sarah, and with her, everything that remained human inside James. He never forgave himself. And maybe that's why, years later, in front of a simple plus-size waitress, he asked for a hug, because deep down he was still the same man trying to find the time he lost, the time Sarah said still existed. Sarah wasn't just James's wife. She was the last thread keeping him connected to real life. And when that thread broke, nothing else made sense. The accident happened on a clear afternoon, one of those cruel ironies of fate, when everything seems too calm for something terrible to happen. James was at a meeting, surrounded by numbers and contracts. When the phone rang, the words he heard didn't form sentences, just noises that tore him apart. Sarah's car had collided on the highway, and she didn't survive. For an instant, the man who controlled everything lost his footing. His mind, used to solving crises in seconds, couldn't react. He stood there, staring at nothing, while the world crumbled in silence. When he finally arrived at the hospital, everything was already over. There was no body, no voice, no chance. Just a dented ring and a note with a phrase that seemed to mock him. "There's still time." Those 3 words became a ghost. He repeated them like a faithless prayer, trying to understand what Sarah meant by that. But time for him had stopped there. The mansion transformed into a mausoleum. The lights remained on, but the brightness was cold, almost morbid. James walked the corridors aimlessly, hearing the echoes of Sarah's footsteps that no longer existed. In every reflection in the golden mirrors, he saw her face. He tried to work, but nothing made sense. He bought companies, closed deals, expanded the empire, but everything was just a way to escape. The man who was once feared was now a slave to his own regret. He asked himself all the time, what if I had arrived earlier? What if I had told her I loved her before she left? But questions don't bring back what's gone, and guilt is like a chain. The more you try to break it, the tighter it gets. James stopped believing in happiness. He began to avoid birthdays, special dates, any memory that could reopen the wound. And still, all it took was for the wind to blow a certain way for him to smell Sarah's perfume in the air. It was a silent torment, the kind of pain that doesn't scream, it just consumes. What few knew is that, during that period, James thought about giving up everything. He had power, influence, money, but he no longer had a reason. The nights were long, and the pillow carried more tears than sleep. Sometimes, he woke up in the early morning believing he had heard Sarah's voice calling his name. Other times, he caught himself talking alone, asking for forgiveness. But forgiveness didn't come because he couldn't forgive himself. Each dawn, he put on the mask of the ruthless billionaire, pretending nothing had changed. But his gaze gave him away. That man was broken inside. And the most curious thing is that, when the world looked at him, they still saw the same James as before, arrogant, powerful, invincible. Only he knew that, behind the expensive suit, there was a heart begging for a little peace. It's at this point that the story transforms, because, without realizing it, life was already preparing a new encounter, one that would test everything he believed about himself, and that would make him relive something he thought was lost: hope. It was on a rainy night that fate decided to cross the paths of James and Emily. The billionaire, tired of the silence of his own home, went out driving aimlessly, just to escape the thoughts that haunted him. The streets shone wet, and the city lights seemed to mock his loneliness. He parked in front of a small neighborhood diner. Simple, almost forgotten by the rich, but alive in a way he no longer remembered. The smell of home cooking, the timid laughter of customers, and the sound of an old song on the radio created an absurd contrast with the cold world he was used to. Upon entering, James was greeted by a young plus-size woman, with a sweet smile and serene gaze. Emily. She didn't know who he was, nor what that man carried inside. She simply treated him as she treated everyone, with respect and kindness. She asked if he'd like to sit by the window and, with a slight bow of her head, wished him a good evening. Seems like little, right? But for someone who lived surrounded by flattery and self-interest, that simplicity sounded like an invisible hug. While eating, James watched Emily in silence. She moved carefully between tables, balancing trays and smiles. She wasn't the perfect waitress from luxury restaurants, nor the image the world usually associates with beauty. And maybe that's exactly why she was so real. There was something about her that conveyed calm, a lightness that James hadn't felt in years. When their eyes met by chance, he felt a strange discomfort, not from contempt, but from recognition. It was as if that woman, unknowingly, could see through his armor. Emily asked him if everything was okay, and he just nodded. Neither of them knew it, but that brief encounter was about to become the turning point in two completely different lives. Sometimes God, or fate, call what you want, doesn't shout. It just whispers in the form of coincidence. And that's exactly what happened there, a coincidence with purpose. In the following days, James returned to the diner. First, telling himself it was just for the quiet atmosphere. Later, without excuses, simply because he needed to be there. And somehow, Emily was always nearby. She didn't treat him like an important man, nor did she try to impress him. She just listened. She had the rare gift of making people feel comfortable, of transforming silence into dialogue and pain into lightness. And for a man who had forgotten the meaning of empathy, that was disarming. Emily didn't make speeches or offer advice. Sometimes she just smiled and said something simple, but full of truth. It was in one of those conversations, when she saw him distant, lost in thoughts, that she said something that would be engraved in him. Kindness doesn't make us weak, James. It just reminds us that we're still human. He remained silent, but inside, something broke. And at the same time, something began to be reborn. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. James began to realize that, despite all the money and power, there was something he could never buy. The feeling of being seen as a person and not as a billionaire. He returned to the diner countless times, always hoping to escape the loneliness that haunted his mansion, and always finding Emily in the same place, with the same warm smile, simple and genuine. There were no judgments, ironies, or hidden interest, just attention and empathy. Every word she said, every gesture care when serving him, seemed to dissolve a bit of the ice he carried in his heart. He still maintained his rigid posture, his shoulders raised to severe expression, but internally something was moving, something he hadn't felt in years. Over time, he realized that those small conversations and shared moments were like balm for his pain. He began to allow himself to feel things he previously repressed, and to realize that humanity is not weakness, but strength. Emily, with her silent patience, seemed to understand more than any therapist or counselor could comprehend. She didn't ask invasive questions, didn't judge past mistakes. She just listened attentively and sometimes let slip words that echoed in James's soul. He remembered what his wife Sarah used to say, and almost unconsciously began to feel that he could, yes, be a different man. With each smile she offered to customers, with each kindness she showed in her service, James saw that compassion still existed, even in a world dominated by cruelty and ambition. He began to understand that kindness is not concession, but choice, and that the choice to live with empathy could, perhaps, heal wounds that years of power and guilt had opened. He felt a strange lightness, almost forgotten, as if he removed an invisible weight from his shoulders. On one of those days, while watching him pensively, Emily said calmly, "James, kindness doesn't make us weak. It just reminds us that we're still human." That hit him like a soft but firm punch, awakening emotions he thought he had lost forever. For an instant, he felt vulnerable, and that didn't embarrass him but liberated him. He realized that perhaps everything he was looking for was in that hug he didn't have, in that extended hand he didn't accept, in that silent understanding that no one had given him. Real stories aren't made only of grand moments. Sometimes, in the small actions of someone who doesn't even imagine their importance, the spark emerges that can ignite a profound transformation. And James, a man who once believed that feelings were weaknesses, began to feel something new. Hope, a silent hope, spreading inside, preparing him to face what he feared more than any investor or competitor, his own heart. Months later, James made a decision that seemed merely rational, but carried with it an enormous emotional weight. He bought the restaurant chain where he had met Emily. To the world, it was just a smart investment, an expansion of his empire. But for him, it was more than that. It was a way to remain close to something that finally made sense, to someone who had touched his soul in a way he thought impossible. He watched from afar as Emily worked, and felt that behind her smile was the truth he had been seeking: kindness, patience, humanity. However, fate has its ways of testing even the most sincere transformations. On one of those nights, during a corporate dinner, one of the investors, an arrogant and cruel man, began making comment about Emily's weight, laughing at the situation, pointing, mocking. James felt his body freeze. Blood rushed to his head, his heart raced, and for a moment, the desire to hide, to disappear, or to return to being the cold man everyone knew, almost won. The entire room became uncomfortable. Some customers laughed nervously. Others looked at nothing, trying to ignore the tension. Emily, surprised and embarrassed, held the tray tightly, not knowing where to look. This wasn't just public humiliation. It was a reflection of everything James hated in the world: cruelty, prejudice, indifference. But unlike years ago, something inside him had changed. He felt guilt and shame consume him painfully, remembering his own past. The cold firings, the ruthless business deals, the people who had suffered because of his limitless ambition. Each cruel comment resonated like an echo of the choices that once made him invincible, but now left him vulnerable. James suddenly realized that he couldn't remain just an observer. The moment demanded action, and that action wasn't financial nor strategic. It was human. What happened next changed everything. James took a deep breath, felt the weight of pride and pain, and stood up. Each step toward the center of the room seemed to echo in the ears of those present. Eyes turned to him, and the air became denser, almost suffocating. The billionaire, who had once intimidated crowds with words and contracts, now prepared for a gesture that was completely different, human. A gesture that couldn't be measured in money, status, or power. And as he approached Emily, the world around seemed to stop, as if waiting in suspense for what was to come. In that instant, there were no investors, journalists, or wealth. There was only James, vulnerable, and Emily, confused, but ready for something that would transform them both. Fate's test was in progress, and the way he reacted would define not only his present, but the course of everything that was still to come. Before the absolute silence of the room, James felt the weight of every decision that had brought him there. The eyes of all those present fixed on him, each gaze loaded with expectation, judgment, and curiosity. He felt his heart race, his hands tremble, his throat tighten. The man who had once commanded empires and destinies now found himself at the mercy of a simple gesture, but one loaded with meaning: a hug. James took a deep breath, felt the air freeze in his nostrils, and finally said, with a choked voice, almost a whisper that seemed to pierce through the restaurant's luxury walls, "Hug me," in front of them. The phrase, short and direct, seemed to carry centuries of pride, pain, and regret. Emily, for a few moments, remained motionless, not knowing if she understood the request or if she just felt the weight of the emotion emanating from him. The young plus-size waitress never imagined that one day she would become the bridge between the most powerful man in the city and his own humanity. As she slowly walked toward James, the world around disappeared. The malicious comments, the nervous laughter, the shine of crystal and china, everything vanished before that moment of pure vulnerability. James felt his body relax when Emily finally wrapped him in a hug. There was no shame, no falseness, only connection. The human warmth he had avoided for years filled every space that wealth and power could never reach. He collapsed, slowly, allowing himself to cry silently, while memories of Sarah surfaced, mixing pain and tenderness. Each tear seemed to wash away a bit of the arrogance that had defined him for years, leaving him naked before himself and everyone. The previously critical gazes were now silent accomplices to a transformation that could no longer be ignored. And in that hug, more than affection, there was redemption. James felt that years of suffering, guilt, and loneliness dissolved in instants. He realized that Despite all the money, all the power, and all the control, true strength was in that simple human gesture, in recognizing his own fragility and in the courage to open up. Emily, still surprised, felt the intensity of that moment and understood that something inside her had also changed. The waitress who had always believed herself invisible now became protagonist of the story of a man who was finally learning the value of compassion. And while those present remained in absolute silence, James knew that this was only the first page of a new chapter in his life, a chapter that would change everything, but that, curiously, began with a hug, and that would soon reveal the next steps of transformation no one had ever imagined. After that night, James disappeared from the financial world's radar. It wasn't escape. It was transformation. He no longer wanted headlines or empty praise. He didn't seek recognition or power. Every gesture, every action came to have a meaning that no money could buy. He sold part of his companies, but not for corporate strategy, for life decision, driven by an internal urgency to repair years of coldness and guilt. He created a foundation in honor of Sarah, dedicated to supporting humble workers, financing children's education, and offering opportunities he himself never received. Each visit to schools, each supported project, each smile from a benefited child, awakened in him an unprecedented sensation, genuine peace. James, who believed that power was domination and control, discovered that true power was in serving, in doing good without expecting anything in return. It was a new sensation, sweet, almost frightening for someone used to dictating rules and fearing weaknesses, but deeply liberating. Each day he felt lighter, as if the weight of decades of pride and mistakes was being removed from his shoulders, and he understood that life isn't measured in wealth, but in impact and love. James's transformation didn't happen immediately. It was a slow process, full of discoveries about himself and about the world. He began to frequent his own restaurant not as a millionaire, but as a volunteer, serving, listening, observing. Each meal delivered, each smile received, showed him that the value of a life isn't in what you possess, but in what you offer. The relationship with Emily, the young plus-size waitress, became a symbol of that new journey. She remained simple, discreet, with the natural kindness she had always had, without realizing that her presence had become essential for the reconstruction of James's soul. He learned that it's not about grand gestures or appearances. True compassion manifests in everyday acts, in the small choices that can change an entire life. With each encounter, each conversation, he absorbed something money can't buy: humanity, empathy, the ability to love and forgive, and for the first time in decades, he felt complete, as if he were truly living for the first time. The impact of James's change began to be felt by everyone who crossed his path. He stopped being the feared and ruthless man, becoming a reference to generosity and integrity. He visited underprivileged communities, helped families find opportunities, supported children with education, and dreams that previously seemed impossible. Each action was a silent response to his own cruel past, a way to transform pain into service and regret into hope. James discovered that genuine happiness can't be bought, nor conquered by power or fortune, but by the ability to improve others' lives and reconnect with himself. And while the world still remembered him as a ruthless tycoon, he knew he had conquered something much greater: the right to start over, to forgive, to love, and to be human again. True redemption wasn't in the contracts, but in the hearts he touched, and in the silent hug that one day changed his life forever. Time later, James returned to the restaurant, but not as a billionaire or investor. He was there as a volunteer, helping to serve meals to underprivileged families, listening to stories and learning from each person who crossed his path. The place that had once been just a refuge became a point of transformation, not just for him, but for everyone around. Each plate delivered, each smile received, each gesture of gratitude reinforced the certainty that true power isn't measured in wealth, but in the ability to touch lives. Emily, the young plus-size waitress who changed his life, continued there in her discreet way, without realizing the monumental impact she had caused on James. The billionaire who once lived surrounded by loneliness and guilt now found meaning in the simple act of serving, realizing that compassion generates more powerful results than any business strategy. And each day, He understood that the hug he once asked for wasn't just a gesture, but the symbol of profound transformation, capable of healing wounds that money and status could never reach. The reunion with Emily was silent, but loaded with emotion. When he found her at the end of her shift, their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no distance, judgment, or power. There was only humanity. James smiled with humility and said, simply, almost as a confidence, "You reminded me that I could still change." Emily, surprised, felt the warmth and sincerity of that moment and returned the smile, moved. And there, in that small gesture of recognition, was proof that real stories can transform not only those who live them, but everyone who participates in them. James finally understood that leadership and influence don't come from strength or fear, but from the ability to inspire, touch hearts, and create legacies that go far beyond money or title. Each act of compassion became a seed, and each smile received a reward that no financial investment could ever offer. Since then, James came to be known not for his fortune, but for his compassion. His story, marked by mistakes, losses, and regrets, transformed into an example for those who believed change was impossible. He discovered that courage isn't facing competitors or markets, but facing yourself, asking for forgiveness, loving, and starting over. And every time he saw Emily smile, he remembered that true strength isn't in controlling the world, but in allowing the world to touch us, transform us, and inspire us to do good. He left a legacy that would last much longer than his financial empire. The ability to humanize success, to show that empathy and kindness are greater than any material power. And in that restaurant, surrounded by family, smiles, and emotional stories, James finally understood what Sarah had always known, that the true value of life is in loving, serving, and transforming the lives of those who need it most, without fear, without reservations, without shame. If James's story teaches us anything, it's that true power isn't in wealth, status, or titles, but in the courage to open up, ask for forgiveness, love, and transform lives, yours and those around you. So I ask you, how many times has pride or fear already prevented you from acting with humanity? Each gesture of compassion, each sincere smile, each opportunity to do good creates an impact that no money can buy. And now it's your turn to decide. Are you going to keep letting fear control you, or are you going to act, break internal barriers, and start transforming the world around you? If you want to continue learning stories that inspire real changes and discover how small attitudes can generate great results, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the first step to changing your life and impacting others starts now. And it can be simple, powerful, and completely transformative.